Hi guys, welcome to week 7 where we're going to cover off DNS. We're going to go through an introduction and overview of its relationship to sports performance. So what we're going to cover off today is we're going to run through what DNS is, or dynamic neuromuscular stabilization. We're going to have a look at how it relates to sports performance and how I use it with the athletes that we work with at APE. We're going to have a look at how we go about assessing it in a really simple way, and then we're also going to go over the application it has in our training environment. This is going to be much more practical, and it's a really quite in-depth concept. So this is more of an introduction to the basic concepts today, and then over time we'll start to develop a greater understanding as we apply it to the program. So in a nutshell, what is DNS? So the simplest way to probably put it is it's a breath and movement-based exercise treatment that prioritizes stability to improve pain, dysfunction, and performance. So it looks at all different elements of movement and coordination, specifically trying to develop stability in the body structures. And it really starts off with basic postural and breathing exercises. Traditionally, it's used in a rehabilitation setting, but it has some really nice comparisons to sports performance, movement, function, and that sort of stuff. It's based off the scientific principle of developmental kinesiology. And specifically, it looks at the neurophysiological aspect of the locomotion system. So essentially, we're looking at how the brain processes movement function and how we move from A to B. It focuses on movement patterns developed during the first 12 months of maturation. And so what we want to think about like this is essentially from birth, we are born with a software that naturally develops across the first 12 to 15 months of maturation, which takes us from being unable to support ourselves to eventually being able to stand and walk and even run. And what we're looking at when we're working with different populations is that when we develop dysfunctions and stuff is we're using this 12-month model to regress and address movement dysfunctions, and then use that model to sort of repattern or rewire those dysfunctions. So the DNS model, as I mentioned, has the 12 months of maturation. So you can see on the left-hand side of each poster is the prone positions, and on the right-hand side is supine positions for each phase of development. And this is a natural progression chart which demonstrates the positions that we try to replicate in the rehabilitative or exercise prescription approach. And so we'll go through some of these in our practical sessions, and you can start to see some commonalities in terms of what we already look at with global movement patterns in strength and conditioning and how it applies to this natural maturation. So the principles that we're going to look at in sort of more detail to understand what DNS is we're going to have a look at respiration, joint centration, body awareness, joint and core stabilization, and also developing quality of support. So when we're using DNS, the first thing we want to look at is we want to introduce optimal breathing patterns. And so if the breathing patterns are not sort of optimized, then trying to address any other element of functional performance is really a waste of time. What we're trying to do first is we're trying to achieve anterior elevation. So we're looking for the expansion around the belly button region, and this will give us feedback that we're getting some good diaphragmatic expansion, and we're starting to inhale that oxygen lower into the diaphragm. The second part we're trying to look for is lateral expansion. So we're looking at the oblique region below the rib cage, so in between the rib cage and the top of the ASIS, and we're looking for lateral expansion both left and right sides. And commonly what we see with dysfunctions is that one side might be more than the other, so we're trying to facilitate expansion in both areas here. And the third one we're looking for is posterior expansion. So we're looking for expansion through the lumbar erectors, and we're trying to create a waistband of tension, so from the belly button right around to the back of the spine and through. And the greater our expansion there across the front, sides, and back, the greater facilitation of stability that we'll create through the body. The next thing we want to look at is joint centration. This refers to the optimal joint position for achieving the most effective mechanical advantage. It allows for optimal load transference across joints and the kinetic chain. And it serves two key purposes. And the first one is creating maximal muscle pull, or what we more understand in strength and conditioning terms as force production. And it also works to protect passive joint structures. So it works in a stability sense. So essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to center the joint structure in the most optimal position to increase our surface area or contact with another joint and or a floor surface to ensure that we create stability around that structure to then allow force to transfer up and down the chain or apply force into and outside of an object or the ground. Okay, so we're trying to expose that joint to the most optimal position. Body awareness. So when we're using DNS to influence body awareness, there's really two main concepts we're looking at, and that's motor control and proprioception. The DNS exercise will facilitate a position or movement that provides increased context for the nervous system or the neurophysiological system to understand the skills/task in greater detail. And going back to motor control and proprioception, if we're looking at the motor control enhancement, we're educating the body to understand how to move in a more efficient or effective manner. And proprioceptively, we're looking at allowing the body to identify where it is in space more appropriately. So the DNS exercises help to facilitate that. And this facilitation will lead to either improved motor control or proprioception. The four phases that we want to understand here is that we still use the four phases of competence, and that applies really closely to this. And this will help identify where we're working with an athlete across the 12-month maturation model. So if the awareness is quite low, then starting earlier on in that developmental model is going to be more appropriate for improving those motor control and proprioceptive qualities. And then if they're quite competent, then it's a natural progression of those qualities. So the key thing when we're trying to enhance the body awareness is that we're using those DNS exercises to facilitate greater understanding of how to move the body and greater understanding of where the body is in space. Joint and core stabilization is another really key component. There are three main areas we're looking for developing this in the DNS model, and that is the shoulder. We're looking for neutral scapula. The torso, so we're looking for a neutral spine from cervical to lumbar. And then the hips, we're looking for a neutral pelvis, so trying to avoid anterior pelvic tilt. And this goes back to the previous principles of joint centration and stability as well. Now, we want a priority of the cervical and shoulder regions occurs when addressing instability and dysfunction or pain. And stability here will help address dysfunction further down the chain. So the idea here is that we want to go from a top-down approach. Working on improving cervical or shoulder function will help improve anything that's dysfunctional down the chain. And this is because the nervous system or the brain's comprehension of these tasks starts from the top down. So it will find it easy to process cervical and shoulder information than it will torso and hip function. So we focus on that top-down approach. The key things we want to look for with this is we want to look for where the belly button is positioned. So is it more to the left side or the right side? We want it ideally in the middle. Where does that relate to the eyesight? So you can see on these pictures of Roger Federer, I am a huge Roger Federer fan, but that's not the only reason for the topless photos, is we can see that his eyesight and his belly button line are really quite symmetrical. And that's a really key thing, is that they remain in line. And that's going to ensure that the spinal alignment stays really, really tidy. And that's also going to help achieve spinal length. So there are clues that we can look for on the body once we understand the movement of what we're trying to achieve, that will allow us to understand if that joint and core stabilization is there. Okay, so the key things there are shoulder, torso, hip, looking for neutral positions, working from the top down, addressing cervical dysfunction first and shoulder dysfunction, and ensuring that the alignment is clearly there using landmarks such as the belly button, the nipples. So we're looking to make sure the nipple line are even and where that eyesight is focused. Quality of support. So this involves the external support of an object, a person, facilitating the position. The goal with providing quality support is to provide assistance that could not be otherwise achieved by the individual themselves. So this is generally a regression when people are unable to facilitate the exercise that we're trying to get them to do or work on the functionality of what they're trying to improve, and we're trying to facilitate that position. So if they're unable to achieve the position that we're looking for them to get, then physical assistance is going to play a huge role in this. And this is especially in the early parts where we're trying to create context and help facilitate the movement awareness of these exercises. There's a few ways we can do this. So as I mentioned, we can do the physical hands-on approach where we're providing stability more often than not. And this could be pressing on landmarks, key landmarks to create those neutral positions. We can use external weights to facilitate joint resistance, so working with and against gravity to create tension and support. We can also use banded resistance, and that's more of a progressive model. Is once they start to adapt from basic body weight control, is we can use banded resistance to improve the support or the feedback system. And that's a key thing as well. Is a lot of this is around creating feedback, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to facilitate the brain's awareness of that position. So the greater the feedback provided, the greater the body can understand the context of the movement or exercise, and then start to reprogram that as the correct movement priority. So a couple of sports examples here. We've got the golf swing, the sprint, and again, Roger Federer with the tennis. We can see in Roger's image, there's some really nice joint centration with the knee over the ankle. The hips are quite even. The left arm comes out in a really nice extension pattern to counterbalance that right arm. The golf swing, we can see the legs are really even with that torso rotation. And what you can see is the creases in your shirt represent that belly button will be rotating, which is a really effective hip position. And then Asafa Power is one of the DNS sort of favorite examples to use. He's got a terrific neutral spine through that triple extension pattern during his acceleration. So when we're looking at the sports model, is we're trying to look at the principles of DNS, what we're looking for, and we're just trying to find comparative environments where that relates to in sporting context. We're not trying to necessarily change the skill based off the DNS model, but we can use the comparisons to understand which exercises are going to be more appropriate for which sports. There are three key things we're looking for with the sports element, and that's DNS is going to help facilitate the improvement of motor skill development. And this isn't in context what I was saying earlier in terms of getting the DNS exercise to directly replicate the motor skill of the sport, or vice versa, get the sports skill to change to the DNS model. What we're trying to understand is that we can create relative context to allow greater skill development to occur. So this might be creating unilateral stances that replicate a sporting movement. It might be creating more awareness and postural holds in positions that replicate the positions they're getting on sport. So it might be, as simple as, is it a one-legged exercise? Is it double-legged exercises? Is the center of mass low to the ground, or is it high to the ground? Is it overhead reaching sport? Is it a reaching down on the ground sport? Is it predominant lower body, upper body? Are there rotational elements? So, for example, if there's a rotational exercise, facilitating rotational control in a DNS setting might help facilitate greater awareness when they go to explore the motor skill environment. And then also understanding, is the sport ipsilateral or contralateral? So looking at our contralateral sports such as running and skiing and those sorts of things, is we're going to look for DNS movements that facilitate contralateral coordination. And then also ipsilateral sports, so things like tennis or MMA or surfing, where we can start to increase the motor demand on those ipsilateral movements to help facilitate greater control when they go to play their sport. So again, it's not about replicating it, it's just about facilitating similarities and training for that sort of broader context of the sport and not worrying about the specificity. So as simple as doing something in a contralateral pattern has a nice contralateral transference to contralateral sports. And same thing with ipsilateral. Low center of gravity, low center of gravity. So we're looking for those key relationships. The other key thing is, with all the qualities that we're looking for in DNS, is we're going to help develop really good movement stability. And the whole principle behind, one of the key principles behind DNS is that everything will start with stability. And we know this, if we don't have stability in the athlete's performance, their chance of injury is really high. Their chance of performance is going to be reduced if they don't have that basic stability across their movement patterns. And the third one is physical conditioning. So you're looking at the qualities of power, speed, strength, and endurance. Now, obviously, looking at the DNS exercises we've sort of covered off and the practical stuff we'll do, they're slow and they're controlled and they're static in a lot of their movements. So traditionally, from a strength and conditioning mindset, they're not going to be developing power, speed, and strength directly. What they will be doing is they'll be doing a few things to help facilitate that. So kinetic linking or joint centration is going to help with the transference of energy the body already has. So that improving that transference and that efficiency is going to help expression of power, expression of speed. So it's indirectly setting the body up to help transfer what it already has. And the one thing that makes DNS really effective in sports performance is that what we're able to do is we're able to see sometimes instant improvement in speed, power, strength, endurance qualities and efficiency qualities by allowing the athlete to explore what they already have. So a lot of us have what we call as our genetic potential. We already have a physical quality, but our ability to execute or apply that physical quality is reduced. So improving those DNS qualities may help transfer those training elements a little bit more effectively. The other thing that DNS can do from a physical conditioning perspective is it can allow for a greater training tolerance to occur. So if we're looking at decreasing the dysfunction of movements, increasing the functionality, increasing the accessibility to training, the opportunity to train these qualities specifically, is going to be increased. So that's the real goal there, is trying to improve the efficiency of movement, coordination, stability, and skill development to allow greater training frequency and greater execution of training. So assessing it, we start with basic breath assessment. So we do this in a passive sitting position. We also do it in a supine active position. The reason for this is we want to see how the body works passively against resistance, and then also can it work to stabilize. So there's basically a beginner and a more advanced testing system, and we're looking for that anterior, lateral, and posterior expansion through the breath. And that's our first protocol. So we'll go through this practically and it'll make a lot more sense. What we want to do there is we want to look at how the body, if there is pain or dysfunction, then we want to look at where that's occurring, and we're going to use our developmental positions to identify 2 to 3 positions, and we're simply going to assess them and understand the degree of the dysfunction. Or it could also be how it relates to the sport. So if there's no dysfunction, we can put them in ipsilateral or contralateral positions as it pertains to their sport and understand what is their control there. And if there is an inability to perform those exercises as sort of required, then we know that's a really good place to start. And then it's a matter of regressing that exercise to facilitate where they are in the motor development process. So understanding, is their motor control ready for it, if we need to regress or progress that movement. And then the third phase is we want to evaluate the actual sports movement. So looking at principles of DNS and looking at footage or competition of them playing their sport. And this could be live, it could be slowed down, and just trying to look for movement similarities. And what that will help create is an understanding of how we can go about facilitating DNS in their program. So it's by no means the be-all and end-all, but it is a nice tool to understand. If the breath is poor, then addressing that will be enough. If they're unable to perform 2 or 3 movements where they may report pain or dysfunction or things that you've picked up in the gym, then addressing regressions of those movements and incorporating that in a movement prep or a supplementary exercise program will be really appropriate. And if that's quite good, then you can move past those 2 phases and start to look at the evaluation of sports movement. In terms of how we apply it, currently there are sort of 4 ways we apply it in our system, and that's in movement prep. So looking at improving body awareness, motor control. This can be things like our bear crawl variations, our breathing drills, anything that relates to that spinal awareness or goes back to those DNS principles. In some cases, we'll use it specifically in core training, and this might be the variation of traditional movements such as mountain climbers or bird dogs, and starting to specify where our athletes fit in on that progression-regression model. The third one is rehabilitation. So people that are coming back from certain injuries will definitely find this more appropriate, and that's when we'll take a more specific approach to where the dysfunctional pain is occurring. It's a really nice way to keep the body moving, ensure that movement coordination and motor control is still occurring despite dysfunction or injury somewhere else. So for example, if someone's got a hip injury, we might be able to work on some shoulder mobility or shoulder function stability during this period. And the fourth one is recovery or regeneration. So using it after sessions from a breathing perspective to increase and facilitate awareness to start that recovery process and start to tell the body to start to slow down. The other thing is we can use it as regeneration between training sessions to ensure preparation for the next training session is really appropriate. So the thing about DNS is it has a low training stress. Whilst the exercises might be challenging in their environment, they're not super taxing on the body. So the frequency and the incorporation of it during high training times or as recovery sessions, regeneration sessions can be really effective. So there are 4 really key ways to go through it. If you guys want a bit more reading on this, you can jump on the rehabps.com, which is actually the Prague School, the DNS website, which will have a little bit more information. They've got a heap of research on there as well. There are 3 people that you can get some sort of more visual ideas and understandings straight away. So Mark McGrath and the Movement Solution, who are both located in Victoria, they're the only two that really practice it in Victoria. They're definitely a great starting point. And Rentala Flow is one of the main guys from Europe who implements it. So have a quick look at those guys if you want some quick video understandings. As I mentioned, we'll go through it in more detail on Friday, and the physical side of things will definitely help you understand the context and the application of the DNS principles a lot clearer. So hopefully this provides a quick snapshot and context for what DNS is and what encompasses it. And then I really look forward to taking you guys through some of this stuff on Friday. You start to understand individually how it can influence both you and people that you're working with.